Okay, everyone, we're going to get started here. I want to welcome you to FDD's Conference Room Series. My name is Jonathan Schanzer. I'm the Vice President for Research here at FDD. We hold events like these somewhat often, and today we are particularly pleased to have a one-on-one with a very interesting official here from Israel. Before we get started, I just want to say a few words about FDD. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization working to defend free nations against their enemies. FDD was founded shortly after 9/11 by a group of visionary philanthropists and policymakers who understand the threats facing America, Israel, and the West. Those affiliated with FDD come from many backgrounds and political perspectives, but all believe that no one should be denied basic human rights, including minority rights, women's rights, and religious freedom, that free and democratic nations have a right to defend themselves and an obligation to defend one another, and finally, that terrorism, the deliberate use of violence against civilians to achieve political objectives, is always wrong and must never be condoned. Before I introduce my guest, I want to just make sure that everyone's cell phone is off, a very un-Israeli thing to ask of all of you. And so with that, let me welcome today Superintendent Micky Rosenfeld, who serves as the official foreign press spokesperson for the Israeli National Police. Mr. Rosenfeld is a former officer of the Israeli Police Force's Counterterrorism Unit and head of the counterterrorism training for the Border Police. I want to just make a note here that we are grateful for our Soldiers Speak for sponsoring Mr. Rosenfeld's U.S. visit. Our Soldiers Speak is a non-governmental, non-for-profit organization that convenes seminars and information sessions pertaining to the IDF. So let me start by just asking you a very simple question to kick this off, and that is, how does the Israeli police fit within the broader structure? I mean, we have the IDF, obviously, which has an extremely significant presence in Israel. You've got Mishmar HaGvul, which is the border police. You've got Shabak, the Shin Bet, the internal security services. So you have this matrix of security organizations within Israel already. How does the Israeli police fit into this matrix, if you could explain?
Of course. The Israeli National Police today is in charge of all internal security. Every incident that takes place both on a criminal level as well as a terrorist level, the Israeli National Police are on the front lines. Within the Israeli National Police, we have 28,000 police officers. And as you mentioned, that's correct, 9,000 are working within the border police, which means when there's regular police patrols that take place in and around the different areas to step up security based on threats or any incidents that occur, we both have border police officers as well as the Israeli National Police in their national uniform that can respond to any incident on any level, and that can be anywhere across Israel. As we're familiar with today, the responsibilities being from the north of Israel, the northern border, all the way down to the southern border, and those that are familiar with the different incidences that we have to take into consideration and the threats that can happen, we're talking about both criminal as well as terrorists.
Okay, and perhaps if you can explain to me that there's a difference between Israel's national police and other police forces around the world, that there's a very different role. I think some of it probably has to do with Israel's size, about Israel's very unique security issues. Perhaps if you can explain how Israel's differs from other countries, even in the region or perhaps around the world.
I think what is unique about Israel and Israel's National Police Force is that I would say it's a setup of police officers that know that on one hand we're supporting the community, on one hand we're supporting the different societies, both the Israeli Arab society, both the Jewish society, the Christian society. The majority of our emphasis today in terms of regular police activities is securing both the different cities around the country, as well as Jerusalem, where the main emphasis of our police activity is in fact taking place. That being the three most holy sites, both to the Christian religion, the Muslim religion, and the Jewish religion. And if we look at what has been going on over the last couple of weeks in Israel, so that just gives you an example of a national police force, police units that respond to crime, But at the same time, our same officers are responding to terrorism and threats that we've had to deal with. We don't bring in backup units. We have the same officers in the same uniform responding at the scene as soon as an incident happens. Another important emphasis is also the way that the chain of command is also under one chain of command. We have an Israeli National Police headquarters based in Jerusalem, and all the orders are given to all of our officers until the last of our officers all over the country. So to give you an example, if there's a terrorist threat and we know a specific individual and we know a certain vehicle that is going to leave a certain area, to give you an example, Jenin or a Palestinian area, the last of our officers receive that information and the intelligence is transferred exactly at the right place and at the right time. It works very different from, for example, with the different United States agencies, where you can have information on the table, but unfortunately that information doesn't get transferred to the last of his officers, and when you have a threat and you know about it, you can't deal with it. In Israel it works very different, and our units are fast responding and deal with a tremendous amount of incidents every year. Just to give you an example, and that I was overseas also talking about counterterrorism, and just to give you an example, we've dealt with more than 200 counterterrorism operations just this year in preventing potential terrorists from making their way inside major cities across the country.
So let me just drill down on one thing that you mentioned. You talked about how intelligence gets, once it sort of enters into the bloodstream of the police department, you can act more quickly. Is that intelligence gathered by the police force itself? Is it generated from the outside and ultimately handed off? I mean, here in the United States, we've had issues with what we call stovepiping, where various agencies aren't talking to one another perhaps as closely as they should be. Is that something that that the Israeli system has eliminated? Do you suffer from those same sorts of issues? Perhaps you can explain.
Yeah. The most important emphasis in Israel is coordination. There has to be a high level of coordination. Both the Israeli National Police work together with the IDF in the different areas where there are threats, the different Palestinian areas where we've seen potential terrorists that can come out of those areas. So we coordinate with the IDF on a day-to-day basis. Our police officers are sitting down with IDF officers, talking, discussing the threats, trying to analyze the threats, and of course responding to those threats before they actually are on the ground level inside major cities. An important perspective is that you can imagine if there were to be a terrorist attack that would take place inside Jerusalem, in the capital of Israel, inside the old city, at one of the holy sites, it could change not just what's going on in Israel, but it could change everything that's going on almost in the Middle East. So we take the threats very seriously on all levels. There's tremendous coordination in terms of intelligence, which is what you mentioned, about internal security, meaning with the Shabak, the internal security. But the Israeli police are those units that are on the front line, being involved in actively preventing and actively responding.
Before I get to what's going on right now, which I think probably is on a lot of people's minds here today, if you could just give us a sense of who serves within the police force in terms of ethnic makeup, religious makeup, Orthodox, secular. Can you give us a sense of who's part of the organization?
Yeah. Within inside the Israeli National Police, we have at the moment more than 3,000 out of the 29,000 officers. We have more than 3,000 personnel that are non-Jewish, meaning both Christian, both Muslim, both Druze, and people from, in fact, all across the different sector. It's a tremendously important emphasis on being able to communicate with the different societies, with the Israeli Arab community, making sure that we have enough Israeli Arab officers, both Christian as well as Muslim, that can talk and can communicate. We know when the shops are being open, we know when shops are being closed, we know when the market areas are open, and we know exactly how to talk and discuss and manage what's going on the streets. So we know all the different activities that are taking place. Now, on one hand, to make sure that we have the capability of being one step ahead, one stage ahead before anything takes place. But as soon as anything happens, so our units, and we close the gaps in terms of language and mentality, we understand exactly what is going on, especially within the different Israeli Arab neighborhoods, with emphasis once again on Jerusalem and that goes into all the different neighborhoods, and if you're familiar or not, but we're talking about those neighborhoods within the recent past few weeks where we've dealt with terrorist threats, where we've seen Israeli Arabs who are part of our society, who have unfortunately crossed over from being part of the normal society and being part of coming inside the hospitals and for work purposes, and unfortunately as a result of incitement which has taken place within, unfortunately, the Palestinian community and by Israeli Arabs, those borderline individual and profiles have carried out those terrorist attacks.
So let's talk for a moment about East Jerusalem, for example, maybe the Triangle in the north. These are areas that, we hear the various reports that, for example, East Jerusalem, there are neighborhoods. I remember last summer, for example, in Shuafat, it was a hotbed of activity. How difficult is it for the National Police to enter into these territories, especially when you have the unrest? But also, we continue to hear about in the Triangle, for example, in territories that are largely seen as part of the Islamic Movement, that there is less penetration on the part of the Israeli police or less formal control. Is that the case, and how do the police deal with these challenges?
Realistically, our police officers enter every neighborhood that is necessary, both for criminal operations as well as terrorist operations. There's no such thing as not entering a neighborhood. We're not talking about areas that are particularly dangerous. What does happen is that our police officers know that when we enter inside those different areas, there's a stronger possibility of them getting injured. We know that after we make arrests, then our officers can possibly become under fire, which is something could be dangerous, and we have to make sure that we take every step possible to prevent our officers from getting injured and killed. But at the same time, our police officers and the leaders of the different departments are meeting with leaders of the different Arab communities. Meeting without anything happening on the ground, officers sit down and talk and discuss and try and make sure that the message to the community is that the Israeli Arabs are part of our society. We want to prevent Israeli Arabs from being involved both in criminal incidents or terrorist-related incidents, and that's an ongoing process which continues throughout the year. So our officers are always where we have to be, anytime, any place, and anywhere.
So, and again, before I get into some of the current issues that Israel's dealing with, the one last question that I wanted to ask, I lived in Israel for a while, and people always talk about the bureaucracy and how maddening it can be for Israelis and non-Israelis alike living there. And that the laws, for example, are a tapestry of British laws, Turkish laws, new laws that have been created by the Jewish state. How difficult is it to navigate that system right now? Is it in terms of the bureaucracy, the lines of communication? Maybe you could give us a couple of examples of ways that you've been able to circumvent it, or challenges that you're still dealing with.
Well, I'll give you an example of the way we deal with the bureaucracy, and this gives you an example in connection with what's going on in Israel over the last couple of weeks. There was a change in the policy of the Israeli National Police in terms of individuals, members of the public, that can walk around with arms, due to the fact that we're in a very sensitive period. And as you know, gun control is a sensitive issue. It's a sensitive issue in the United States. It's a sensitive issue, as you can imagine, in Israel as well. But our units train and our units give a backup to individuals who feel it's necessary to get hold of a weapon. So they go through a standard bureaucracy process. We make sure that everyone who's getting a hold of a weapon today has gone through either 3 years in IDF service, or he's living in the certain areas where it's necessary because there's immediate danger. And the bureaucracy process works without any problem whatsoever. Sometimes it can be speeded up, but other times it does take quite a while. Where are the difficulties in the bureaucracy process? I think at a time where Israel is at the time of a crisis, when the Israeli police are at the time of a crisis, so the process is always speeded up. When we need new equipment, new technology, and we need to make sure that we're one step ahead in order to deal with immediate threats, so the bureaucracy is pushed aside. But there are certain issues, bureaucracy issues that are dealt with. But I can tell you, in terms of the Israeli National Police, there is tremendous amount of coordination and understanding from the government. All government decisions that are made are transferred to the Israeli National Police under the Minister of Internal Security, and we normally get the green light for whatever is necessary to be done, both in terms of operations, both in terms of technology, with emphasis on what's going on the ground.
Okay, well, I think now's as good a time as any to ask you about what's going on in Israel right now. What are we looking at, for example, a third intifada? What does it mean that you have so many of these attacks coming from largely East Jerusalem and I guess now parts of the West Bank, that it's not necessarily being driven by the PA or Hamas itself, but that so much of this looks to be organic, that it appears to be driven by Facebook and Twitter and other social media? What is it exactly that we're looking at, and how are the Israeli police responding?
Since the 3rd of October, there has been an increase and a new wave of terrorist attacks that have taken place across Israel. The majority of attacks that took place were inside Jerusalem. If we analyze and try and understand where it's come from, we can see it's coming from the Palestinian Authority. We're talking about incitement that's been going on for months. If we look back to the period of a year ago to Operation Protective Edge, where the Israeli army was carrying out its operation within the Gaza Strip, so we dealt with 3 months of disturbances and tensions within the Israeli Arab community. We dealt with that. A number of strategic decisions were made towards November. And then we saw lone individuals, lone terrorists that were carrying out attacks in order to try and get the agenda, the Palestinian agenda, back on the table. That was taking place until approximately February, March. And then what we saw is, unfortunately, lone individuals, attacks that had taken place. It began just before the summer. And we definitely, if we try and analyze what has been going on, it's been coming from 2 areas: the Palestinian Authority, as I mentioned, and also from the Islamic Movement in the north of Israel. Those are the key problems that we have to deal with. What has happened is that, to give you an example, 200,000 Israeli Arabs living in Jerusalem out of an 800,000 population within Jerusalem, which is a small, relatively small percentage. But if we look at what is going on within inside that percentage of the 200,000 people, we're seeing that there's lone individuals who have unfortunately crossed that borderline. What has happened? The Temple Mount has all of a sudden become an issue. The incitement calling upon the Temple Mount is where it's coming from. And then what has happened is that we're seeing social networks, social internet, we're seeing Facebook. Everything on social media is now playing a game, in fact, in what's going on. But not just theoretically. We're not talking about people who are just talking and conducting conversations on social media. We're seeing the social media turning into actions. We're seeing potential terrorists who want to carry out an attack at 9 o'clock in the morning. They've changed their Facebook page and they've called upon going on the Temple Mount, protecting the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then 3 o'clock in the afternoon, seeing a terrorist attack that has taken place. That, if we try and translate that into a police policy and police operations, that gives us a 4 to 6 hour window opportunity in order to find those potential terrorists. So we have the problem of, number one, the Temple Mount, which I can confirm and tell you is not a problem. We're talking about incitement, theoretical incitement. We're talking about brainwashing, which has affected that small percentage of individuals who have become those potential terrorists. Over the last 3 to 4 weeks, for instance, visits on the Temple Mount have taken place without any problems whatsoever. Muslims come and pray 5 times a day. We've had hundreds of tourists that have visited, and we've had small groups of Jews that come on the Temple Mount as well. So the Temple Mount is fully functional over the last couple of weeks. There hasn't been any age limits also on the Temple Mount itself. But where is the root of the problem? It's definitely the incitement, as I said, from the Palestinian Authority and from the Islamic Movement in the north.
You mentioned that the PA is trying to put their agenda back on the table. Is this to imply that, given all of the emphasis on, for example, Iran or on ISIS, that because the Palestinian issue has been perhaps a secondary or tertiary issue on the world stage, that all of what's happening now is an attempt to reignite the Palestinian issue? Is that what you're implying?
I would prefer on emphasizing in terms of the police operations, but if I translate the police operations and where our emphasis has been over the last couple of weeks, of course, we're talking about, once again, the Palestinian problem coming up again. But we have to clearly differentiate and understand that we're not talking about a period of an intifada. We're not talking about thousands of people on the streets. We're not talking about organized marches and gatherings. We're talking about individuals who at the moment are taking advantage of the situation and trying to put the agenda back once again on the table. Also, if we try and look together and see what the level of attacks have taken place, we're talking about knife attacks. We're not talking about explosive devices. We're not talking about terrorists that have infiltrated from the Gaza Strip. We're not talking about Hamas that are giving orders from Damascus to Hamas in the Gaza Strip and then giving orders to Hamas in the West Bank to carry out an attack. We're talking about the level that we understand of terrorism that is taking place at the moment, and that's what we're dealing with.
You mentioned the Islamic Movement. Perhaps just explain, we've heard a lot about the Islamic Movement in the last couple of weeks. Obviously, it's been making gains since the 1980s, but we hear a lot about the connections to Hamas, that the leader of this movement, Sheikh Raed Salah, was just imprisoned for incitement. If you could just maybe speak for just a minute about what you see from your role as the challenges coming from this movement in the north.
Well, the Islamic movement in the north is seen as a fundamental organization that is anti-Israel and is in fact having an effect on the Israeli Arab community. Now, the Israeli Arab community is part of our society. We don't want the Israeli Arab community to move and distance away from what's going on in the country. There are Israeli Arabs all across the country, from Nazareth in the north, from Akka in the north, and as you can imagine, all the different areas across the country, such as Tel Aviv as well, and Jaffa, Yafo as well. So the Israeli Arabs are part of our society. We have to make sure that we bridge the gaps. An example of that is what I mentioned about the Israeli police officer that is serving inside the Israeli National Police. But in terms of understanding of what's going on in the IS is a separate organization, extremists, which I think is causing a lot of psychological warfare. The activities and what we've seen that we've had to deal with is Israeli Arabs who have in fact tried to leave Israel, make their way to Turkey and enter Syria. We've made a number of arrests of specific individuals, and we're also carrying out to track, and we're always tracking those potential people that have intentions of leaving. We made an arrest recently of a man who in fact said to his family that he's going overseas for 3 weeks to study and he's going to the States. We were tracking him and we realized that he had bought a ticket to go to Turkey, and from there it was clear to us that he was going to make his way from Turkey into Syria. So we want to stop that, as much of that activity before it takes place, and that's something that we're doing all the time. Raed Salah and the Islamic movement in the north is not affiliated and is not IS. Okay? They have the agenda of Israel, Israeli Arabs, the Temple Mount, and trying to deal with those issues which they are trying to push as much as possible. But in terms of radical Islamic organizations, the IS, we can see that it exists within inside the Gaza Strip. We know, and we're tracking what's going on inside the Gaza Strip as well. We can see that there's internal fighting, gun battles, street battles that take place between the Hamas and IS inside the Gaza Strip. And we even know, based on intelligence, is that the rockets that have been fired inside Israel from the Gaza Strip recently have been fired by IS cells and not by the Hamas. So we have to make sure that we're keeping our eyes out as to what's going on down in the Gaza Strip in terms of IS movement. But in terms of the Israeli National Police, we're tracking individuals, Israeli Arabs across Israel. Surprisingly enough, there was an incident that took place just over 10 days ago where we had an Israeli man, a 23-year-old from Jaljulia, who in fact coordinated with the IS in Syria and crossed the Israeli northern border into Syria. which was something which was surprising, as you can imagine. We're normally dealing with infiltration from IS from Syria and preventing anyone from coming inside Israel, and all of a sudden we have a Jaljulia man who's an Israeli Arab, part of our society, crossing the border, and he did that with a parachute.
I want to ask you two more quick questions. We've heard a lot about what's going on the Temple Mount right now, and part of the Palestinian narrative is that there are Jewish extremists that are infiltrating the Temple Mount area. I want to talk about numbers in a moment, but that does bring to mind this question of, we know of one group in particular, Price Tag, that has been carrying out, you could call them terrorist attacks, you could call them criminal attacks. Is this part of the police agenda, dealing with this the small number of Jewish extremists as well?
I think we have to clearly differentiate between a potential threat from someone within the Jewish society, someone who's living in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, and the Temple Mount. We have to put the Temple Mount aside and understand that the Temple Mount is significantly sensitive, and that's to all religions, whether it's Christians that are visiting, of course, to Muslims. And we can see that people, and we've seen an increase in numbers and statistics. Last year there were 10,000 people that visited the Temple Mount. Today we're talking about just over 11,000. So we're seeing a slight increase in terms of numbers and statistics, but I don't want to focus on that, because if there's a decrease in numbers towards the end of the year, then we might find ourselves more or less at the same stage. But just to give you an example of understanding, there are hundreds of people that are visiting on the Temple Mount, and I'm talking about Jewish people because that was your question. But they are visiting in order to visit. Nobody's praying on the Temple Mount according to the law. I'm talking about the dangers that there are. No one is praying on the Temple Mount apart from Muslims. There is only one gate where people can go on the Temple Mount. That's the Mukrabim gate. Okay, that's the only non-Muslim entrance into the Temple Mount. So we're dealing with a lot of sensitive issues in terms of the Temple Mount itself. Police operations are taking place in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, in order to prevent individuals. And you mentioned price tag. Price tag is something that's going around within the media. The understanding, and if we're going to go into the details, what does it mean, price tag? Price tag is a criminal incident with nationalistic motives, meaning individuals, Jewish individuals, who want to protect either their land or the different areas, and that's how we've categorized their activities. Criminal incidents with nationalistic motives. What has happened, and that's over the last couple of years, in fact over the last 2 years, is the amount of damage that it's causing to Israel when an individual, an extremist, and it doesn't matter whether it's right wing or left wing, and I'm talking about someone within the Jewish society, takes part in attacking a Christian building or a church. The amount of damage that does is tremendous, both to the Jewish society, both to the Christian relations, which are tremendously strong throughout the year, especially within the Old City, and so many churches and so many people that are coming to visit. So our police operations and a new unit has been set up in Judea and Samaria, from the Judea and Samaria district, that deals only with criminal issues with nationalistic motives. Those operations will continue as long as necessary, but I can also tell you that these are minor in terms of the scale and size. If we have to map out how many individuals there are, I would say there may be 10 potential individuals that we're closely tracking all the time, and tracking them not on the level of terrorism. We're not talking about potential Jewish terrorists. We're talking about individuals who have attacked Palestinian vehicles, who have thrown stones at Palestinians, and that's the level of police operations that we're dealing with.
Okay, one last question before we go to Q&A, and that is this question of security cooperation. I think the assumption that we have here in the U.S. and perhaps around the world is that security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority is the IDF or the Shabak that is primarily working with Palestinian security forces in the West Bank. But it's my understanding now that actually it's the police that probably has the closest relationship with the PA, even at times like these, that you still have very close cooperation. If you could just speak for 2 minutes just about what that looks like.
Yeah, there's close cooperation and understanding, meetings that are taking place between the Israeli National Police, our officers, mainly within Judea and Samaria, and the Palestinian police. Today also inside the Palestinian police you have the EU cops, which is a tremendously strong organization backed by the United Nations, funding. They have hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to support the Palestinian police, both in terms of equipment, in terms of technology. And we meet and we discuss and deal with the different issues that are relevant to mainly Judea and Samaria. Whether we're talking about terrorism, if there's information that we know about anything that can take place within inside Judea and Samaria, the information is transferred. The majority of operations are carried out obviously by the Israeli National Police as well as the IDF in coordination. But there are other issues that we also discuss, and we sit down and we have conferences with them, such as road accidents that take place on the roads which are used both by Palestinian vehicles as well as Israeli vehicles. If we have suspects that flee the scene and go back into the Palestinian areas, we have to try and find those suspects. If there's been a road accident where we have Israelis that are injured and Palestinians that are injured on the same roads, we have to make sure that we transfer the information, who was involved in the accident, who was behind the accident, who's been taken to hospital. All this information is very important, especially when we have deaths on the road. We want to make sure that Palestinian families know about who's been injured, who's been killed, in the same way as with Israeli families, who's been injured and who's been killed. So that's the type of information. It's an ongoing dialogue, very important. And even when there are tensions that are high in Judea and Samaria, even when we're dealing with terrorist threats, and even when we're dealing with police operations, that ongoing dialogue continues no matter what.
Okay, I want to open this up to the audience. So if you just raise your hand, I'll make sure to call on you and wait for the microphone. And when the microphone does arrive, if you could just please announce your name and affiliation, and then ask your question. And of course, try to keep your question in the form of a question and to keep it as short as possible. Yes, sir.
Michael Kurtzig, who worked on the Middle East in the Department of Agriculture. Just a couple of points. The press over here, of course, very negative side, is saying once again there's a disproportionate response from Israel. That is, they shoot to kill anybody who stabs. That seems to be the impression. That's my first one. Number two, I just want to know, has this had any impact on immigration, any impact on tourism, for example, as in the past, or just so short-lived that it doesn't have much of an impact? Thank you.
In connection with your first question, the Israeli National Police are on the ground at different areas. Just to give you an example, and I'll go into your question. There's more than 3,000 police officers that are in Jerusalem specifically in order to prevent and respond to any terrorist attack. If we were to walk around together in the old city, every 20 to 50 meters, there are a group of police officers within 5 to 8 police officers in order to respond and react. We've seen terrorist attacks that have taken place where the attackers have targeted in between that 30 to 50 meters because they know police officers are everywhere and the police officers' response is almost immediate. Since the 3rd of October, so we're talking about just less than a month, there's been more than 34 terrorist attacks. Less than half of the terrorists, were shot. So if we're going to translate that, that means more than half the terrorists were captured. As a result of that, our police officers, in terms of proportion and in terms of the amount of force that they're using, it's 100% in proportion. You have to take into consideration when you're talking about a split-second decision and you have a distance of approximately 1 to 2 meters, and we've seen that in CCTV footage, and we put that out to all the foreign media, type of attacks that are taking place, and I'm sure everybody's seen that. Our officers are making critical life-saving decisions, both for themselves as well as for members of the public. I mean, what would happen if today you had fanatics, IS, or anyone walking around the streets of Washington or New York or London or Paris with knives and axes? What would you expect the police to do? You'd expect the police to take full responsibility and respond as quick as possible. I can tell you that the Israeli police are experienced enough. For the good or for the bad, we've dealt with a tremendous amount of terrorist attacks on all different levels, both in earlier periods in Israel, as well as what we're dealing with now. So our units know how to respond. When we can make arrests, we do. But when there's no choice, and you're talking about split-second decisions, and you have to shoot, if you can shoot in the leg and make an arrest, it's even better both in terms of the Israeli National Police as well as intelligence. Then you can ask the suspect, where did you come from? Did you work alone? Does your family know? And you can carry out a full intensive investigation. But when there's no choice, The Israeli police have to shoot, and if necessary, have to shoot and neutralize the terrorist. In some cases, the terrorists have been shot and killed. In other cases, they've been brought in alive. Second question? Immigration, correct. In terms of tourism, we've seen a decrease in terms of numbers over the last couple of months. That is something that's taken place, in fact, since the summer period. But we're seeing more or less the end, or towards the end of this period of what's been going on. Over the last 13 days, it was relatively quiet in Jerusalem. There was no attack whatsoever in the capital, which goes to show that there was a shift in terms of terrorist attacks from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria. So we could see the change. But in terms of the economy, things are running normal. If you go to Tel Aviv, there's thousands of people visiting. There has been a decrease in numbers, but we're hoping towards, and I'm talking about the Christmas period, December period, once again, things will improve and the numbers of tourists will go up again.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Nadav Greenberg from Brookings. Thank you very much for being here. And also as someone who grew up in Jerusalem and whose family lives there, I just want to express my appreciation for the work the police is doing to keep residents safe. Thank you for that. My question has to do with the issue of Jewish extremism that we spoke about a bit earlier. In some of the reports and some of the investigations of terrorists that have been captured in recent days and previously, the issue of the killing of the Dawabsheh family in the village of Duma, the Palestinian Dawabsheh family, and the fact that its killers have not yet been apprehended, has come up again and again as a source of tension and fomenting a lot of unrest in Palestinian society. And I'm just curious what your view is of whether that event has lasting impact. I mean, that was an event that was called by, from the Prime Minister on down, an act of Jewish terror. The police also recognize it as such. And so I'm curious if you see that issue of Jewish terror as something with lasting impact, and also if there's any update as to why the investigation on that hasn't yet yielded any results, given that, as you said, we're talking about very limited numbers of Israeli extremists, and these are known quantities. Thank you very much.
As you can imagine, whenever anybody is targeted, and it doesn't matter if it's Jewish or Muslim or Christian, the loss of life is something which is unacceptable, and a terrorist attack is unacceptable anywhere across Israel. In that specific case, there's still an ongoing investigation. From what I understand in terms of the Israeli government and in terms of intelligence sources, there are leads as to who the terrorists are. It's not 100% clear. And I can tell you that one of the problems being is that in previous incidents, and I'm not talking about attacks that have taken place which people have been killed, but in, for instance, attacks that have taken place, burning of houses, Palestinian houses in different Arab neighborhoods, it's very difficult to gather evidence. Although our police units and forensics arrive on the scene, there's still gaps between forensics and what we find on the scene as to actually making the arrest and proving that that is the specific individual. The people that are behind those attacks, they work on their own. They're not using telephones. They're living on remote places, on hilltops. They're known as the hilltop groups that live in the middle of Judea and Samaria. They have no connection whatsoever. If we talk about the profile, we're talking about of people that have left their families, left their homes, and instead of them being homeless, as you see on the streets, they're homeless and they're living on the hilltops in the middle of nowhere. And as a result of that, they've turned and been involved in extremist incidents. We've made arrests of certain individuals who have been involved in throwing stones and attacking family houses and causing damage to vehicles within Palestinian villages. But at the moment, as far as I know, in that specific investigation, it's still an ongoing investigation. Arrests haven't been made yet.
Take a question over there in the corner.
My name is Lee. Legal and Fishcraft from Bureau of Public Affairs.
Yep. Can you speak up a bit? Thank you.
Sorry. Lee from Barron Public Affairs. Also, as an Israeli, I appreciate all your work and want to thank you for that. I do have a question. You mentioned the Hilltop, Noam Vod, and Tag Mechir, but I do wonder, during the high time of the unrest, was there a lot of, I don't know, mainstream Jewish Israeli call for action, meaning vigilantes or Jewish population mainly wanting to basically, sorry, forgot the word, linkom,
Revenge.
Yeah, avenge Arabs for what they did. And are you tracking that? And a second question, which is a general question mostly, do you find that the Israeli foreign policy or national policy of the Prime Minister has much effect on the day-to-day work of the national police as well, mainly the foreign policy? Thank you.
First of all, in terms of revenge attacks, what we're dealing with is, and that's general police operations on tracking those potential terrorists. As soon as we have any indications whatsoever that they are going to be involved in any criminal activity or any terrorist activities, arrests are made. We're making arrests all the time in Judea and Samaria. That's disregard the present tense situation that there is in Israel. So there's continual police operations, and that's part of the Israeli national police policy, and that will continue short-term and long-term, definitely. I think that in terms of the tension that is felt within the general society, after an attack takes place, the message from the Israeli National Police to the public is that we're in control of the situation, and we're not talking about terrorists that are carrying out simultaneous attacks at different institutions, and we're not talking about mass killings. We're talking about, unfortunately, lone terrorists that have carried out the attacks. The response is immediate, and we quickly deal and put a border around those terrorist attacks. The message to the public is that we are in control of the situation. That's why we've taken so many steps. Extra police officers, roadblocks that have been set up in certain areas to coordinate and have much more control on what's going on. Extra IDF personnel that are working under the Israeli National Police and stepping up security as well. An extra 900 security officers on public transport, which is another step in order to make sure that we have more public safety. Tremendous amount of people using transport as well. And that is in general in terms of the police operations. There have been calls to have gatherings in public places. Part of the Israeli police policy is to allow gatherings to take place. It's important for the public to feel confident that, number one, the streets are back to normal, but at the same time, in a democracy country, in Israel, people are allowed to go and walk around, and people are allowed to say what they have to say, and especially when tensions are high. But on no way whatsoever do we let organizations, okay, and I'm talking about organizations that we're familiar with, any right-wing activists or right-wing organizations, to have an illegal demonstration blocking the roads in the center of town or blocking the roads in the center of Jerusalem. That is unacceptable, and we make always plan B, so to speak, after an attack to deal with the possibility of demonstrations. In terms of the government and the Prime Minister's office, the Israeli National Police carry out all options and all actions as well based on the policy of the Israeli Prime Minister. That is transferred, all the information is transferred to the Israeli Internal Security Minister, and actions are carried out by the Israeli police according to that policy. Coordinated from the Prime Minister's office, Internal Security, Israeli National Police. There's no questions asked. Everything that the Israeli police have to do are carried out immediately. And I'm talking about without any hesitation whatsoever, when a government decision was made that it's now time to crack down on security inside Jerusalem and deal with those terrorist attacks. There was a decision that was made that there were going to be certain roadblocks in certain areas. Overnight, already the roadblocks were set up. Logistics are fast, things work very quickly, in the same way as those same roadblocks were removed 48 hours afterwards, because the population realized that security is now going to be implemented. And that's why we even saw the shift of those 13 days where there weren't any terrorist attacks whatsoever inside Jerusalem.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Quentin Beke from the Embassy of the Gabonese Republic. My question is related to the individual that was wearing a jacket, the press jacket, that stabbed the Israeli soldier. Is this incident going to change the relation with the press? Is there going to be like reforms about the credentials? Thank you.
I can tell you as the Israeli national spokesman to the foreign press that we have an ongoing relationship with the FPA, the Foreign Press Association in Israel. We always discuss the different issues, the different dangers that are involved in those people who are working on the front lines and covering very dangerous incidents in certain areas, especially in Judea and Samaria. That was in fact the first time where we saw Arab terrorists taking advantage of the freedom of the press, the freedom of the foreign press especially, moving around in different areas, being so close to IDF personnel. And of course, it's important that everyone is understanding how the IDF work, how the police work, what is going on the side of the demonstrators, how the Israeli National Police are using non-lethal weapons and preventing people from being injured or killed in the same way as we're protecting our officers. But I think that was something which is completely unacceptable. The response was quick at the scene itself as soon as it was clearly seen that we were talking about a terrorist with a knife in his hand. There was no misidentification or no misunderstanding at the scene. The terrorist, in fact, stabbed that IDF officer in his arm. He was injured lightly, and only then was he shot and killed. But in terms of understanding, in terms of the Israeli police policy, we're open-minded in terms of the foreign press. They have all the ability to work in all the different areas. We're not closing any areas whatsoever. And to give you an example, over the last month, the Israeli National Police, which is part of the policy, every attack that has taken place, wherever it's been, both in Jerusalem or across the other parts of the country, the policy is to put out all the footage that we have, all the camera footage, all the CCTV footage of every incident, so that we know and the members of the public can understand what has taken place. There's nothing to hide. Obviously, when issues have to be investigated and questions come up, then we have to deal with those questions. But it's also very important to make sure that we're putting out the accurate picture of what has taken place. We've seen the Arab media many times, instead of putting out 1 minute and 48 seconds of what has taken place, they'll cut the first 20 seconds and they'll cut the Palestinian terrorist with an explosive device in his hand as he runs up to a border police or an Israeli National Police jeep. He throws that pipe bomb, it explodes, no one is injured, but you won't see that. And the Arab media, Palestinian media especially, will cut those 30 or 25 seconds. It's critical for us to show what's going on, and there's been a change in the policy that everything, everywhere, no matter whether it's in Judea and Samaria or within inside the cities, everything's being put out.
Okay, we're going to be wrapping up shortly, so if there are questions now, let's do kind of a lightning round. We'll get a couple of last questions in and let Superintendent Rosenfeld answer them perhaps all at once. So we've got this gentleman here in the middle. If you can keep your questions quickly, and we'll move around over here after that.
Thank you. My name is Mario. I'm from the Portuguese Embassy, and I had the privilege to serve in Israel for almost 7 years. And one of the things, it's a bit philosophical maybe, how do you cope as the spokesperson for the police to explain with this thin line that for an outsider exists between a criminal issue and a terrorist issue? Because on many times, in times of more calm periods. Thank you.
Okay, and we've got a question over here as well.
I'd like to answer the question, please.
You want to answer both of them? Whatever order you'd like. Just want to make sure we get all.
Michael Nachman from the Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs. In your relationship with the foreign press, I would like to get your assessment of the fairness of the reporting that, particularly in the Western world, you pointed out how they're very, the Palestinian position is also very slanted. How do you assess the reporting that is taking place?
Okay, I'll answer the first question, which was in connection with how do we differentiate between criminal and terrorism. I'll give you an example. If there's an explosion that takes place in Netanya, okay, Netanya being just north of Tel Aviv, 35 kilometers, what we know in terms of the type of incident and the type of explosion, we'll understand that's a criminal-related issue. If we look east to Netanya, so we have Tulkarem, Palestinian area. If a Palestinian terrorist wants to carry out an attack, he won't leave the Palestinian area. It would be too difficult for him to go through security, leaving the Palestinian area, going through Israeli security, Israeli road patrols, Israeli security within inside the city to get inside. Netanya itself will have to go through 4 to 5 different security circles. And therefore, if a Palestinian terrorist wants to carry out an attack, he'll carry it out within a kilometer or 2 where he sees the first IDL roadblock or patrol. And therefore, we can clearly understand that we're talking about a criminal-related issue. Always when there is a terrorist attack, and we'll take an example of yesterday, there was a stabbing in Rishon LeZion, which is also relatively close to the Tel Aviv area in the center of Israel. So within the first few minutes, we have to understand, are we talking about a terrorist incident or are we talking about criminal? But within seconds, as soon as we understand that there's been a number of people that have been stabbed, and we're talking about not just one area, but we're talking about 2 different roads at the same time. So the suspicions are more than 80-90% that we're talking about a terrorist attack. And then obviously once the individual is apprehended, so immediately they're taken to the side, they're questioned, we want to know where they're from, they'll have ID on them, we'll know how they came into the different areas where they've come in from, and then immediately there'll be a change of mode, and then if necessary other security circles can come in, intelligence, how did they arrive, are their families involved, and then we'll go through checking the social network, have they put out information, we'll obviously track the phones, and whatever intelligence sources and leads will be implemented. So it's relatively clear based on the experience we have that we can differentiate between what is a criminal activity and what isn't. Where are there difficulties? If you have, let's say, a stabbing incident that can take place in the center of town in Jerusalem, is it going to be criminal? Is it not going to be criminal? Sometimes it takes slightly more time, but it all depends. But our units are normally on the scene, respond very, very quickly in order to find which direction it is. In terms of the foreign press, the foreign press in Israel, we have to understand, they are covering Israel and, as they call it, the Palestinian territories. Even on their cards, you have a certain representative that is not covering just Israel. It's written. He covers Israel and the Palestinian territories. So he's neutral as far as he's concerned. He's covering disturbances in Judea and Samaria, and he's covering terrorist attacks that take place inside Israel as well. That's perfectly understandable, but what is important in terms of the media is to meet with the media, discuss with the media what is the Israeli police policy, what is our agenda, what am I doing on a day-to-day basis before any terrorist attacks takes place. I don't want to meet with the New York Times writer, okay, on the scene of an attack without knowing who the New York Times writer is and what she's going to be writing. So I'll sit down and I'll meet and I'll make sure that ahead of time we know what the Israeli police, she knows as much information about the Israeli police as possible. Ahead of time, she'll know what units there are and she'll understand, and not all of a sudden there'll be a lack of information about what is going on. Where are there problems? We've seen a change over the last couple of years in the representatives that are sitting at the desks of the foreign media in Israel. It used to be 80% Israelis, and now we're seeing there is more local Israeli Arab residents who are working for the international media. Okay? So there is also a change. That's something that we're clearly familiar with, but that doesn't prevent our ongoing relationship in terms of work, transferring information, and meeting on the site. There's no problems whatsoever with that. But that's something that we obviously have to think about. Why has there been a shift, and what are the implications of that shift? But there's a good, just to finalize that question, there's a good ongoing, strong relationship both between me and my people that I'm working with inside Israel, the different foreign press, and that's very, very important in order to try and make sure that what is going on in Israel, the information is transferred quickly, effectively, efficiently, and that's what's taking place almost on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, well, we've reached the end of our time here. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our Soldiers Speak and Benjamin Anthony for bringing Micky Rosenfeld. And Micky, I want to thank you very much for coming to FTD. A round of applause.
Thank you very much.